So most of you watching right now have an NVIDIA chip in your computer. And if you're using Linux, you've probably encountered some issue either installing or using the NVIDIA driver. But the same issues haven't existed on AMD for years now. Why does AMD have such a better experience on Linux? Today I'm going to answer that exact question. I'm going to compare AMD and NVIDIA's user experience on Linux, as well as comparing them to Windows. Instead of describing the experience as the good, the bad, and the ugly, I'm going to be looking at the bad, the good, and the best. Just a disclaimer, I'm not sponsored by AMD or any company mentioned in this video. First, let's look at the downsides. When it comes to AMD, the fully open source Linux drivers don't get all of the fancy features that the closed source Windows drivers. Things like FrameGen and anti-lag are not available to be enabled. There isn't even a utility like there is in Windows. There are community efforts out there like OptiScaler to bring these features to Linux, but they also have some downside. For example, OptiScaler's own GitHub page warns against using it for online games because there's a risk of being banned. However, I will be trying this tool to see how well these features work on Linux, so get subscribed if you want to see that in the future. By contrast, even though NVIDIA requires the drivers to be installed separately, it still provides a basic utility for the user to change some settings around. Things like power management and some rendering settings are available for the user to tinker with. It is definitely not as robust or advanced as the Windows utility, but at least there's something rather than nothing. Speaking of Windows, that Linux experience for AMD is not looking great here because the Windows driver and utility is actually pretty good for AMD. It supports automatic updates and all of the fancy features that your GPU might support. Windows does have the edge here when it comes to user friendliness of the fancy feature. But that's the bad news out of the way. Let's get to the good stuff. Even though there's no official utility for the user using AMD GPUs, the open source drivers themselves are pretty top-notch. Every little bit of performance is squeezed out of the cards when you're playing a demanding game or doing a heavy compute task. Speaking of compute, AMD's ROCm or ROCm software stack is readily available on Fedora and can easily be used to enable heavy compute tasks like running AI models locally. Leave a comment below the like button if you want to see how to do that for yourself. Another GPU task that's very common is video encoding and decoding. If you're watching this on your computer, the decoding is happening right now. The encoding on GPUs requires a bit more work on Fedora. You have to use an external repository called RPM Fusion, which gives you some extra codecs that aren't necessarily available in the open source drivers. There are also some community tools like LACT, which allow you to overclock your GPU. Everything mostly just works. Comparing to NVIDIA after installing the proprietary drivers, AMD is still batting a good average. While gaming performance is basically on par with the NVIDIA counterpart cards, AMD does fall short on the features. NVIDIA cards can use NVENC on Linux just like they can on Windows, and they can also use CUDA for compute tasks, just like they can on Windows. These features are generally just bundled in with the driver. Talking about Windows, AMD's open source drivers on Linux have the same, sometimes even better performance than Windows. It just depends on the game. Although the AMD Windows driver does come with AMD's proprietary video codecs for encoding and decoding, that does not mean Linux is lacking. AMD's open source drivers have excellent compatibility with hardware encoding and decoding through VA API and FFmpeg. Now, AMD by far has the best out-of-the-box experience on Linux. Against NVIDIA, it really shines. All of AMD's major drivers are open source and integrated into the Linux kernel itself. So it doesn't matter which distro you run, as long as it's a recent kernel, your AMD hardware will be running optimally with the open source drivers. The open source drivers are so good, in fact, that you could be running a graphically intensive game with your GPU going at full blast and not even realize you're running open source drivers. AMD has closed source drivers as well for Linux, but they're largely unnecessary unless you have like a professional GPU workstation card. In fact, AMD recently announced that they would be discontinuing the proprietary Vulkan driver in favor of the open source one that is already available in Mesa. By contrast, the NVIDIA Linux out-of-the-box experience is lackluster at best. The most used open source NVIDIA driver that most distros ship with out of the box is called Nouveau, and it is a miracle that this driver works as well as it does. It has been completely reverse engineered by its developers with little to no help from NVIDIA. Even though it does provide basic functionality like displaying your desktop and powering up your card, there are major features missing in most cases. Power management, compute functionality, encoding features, just to name a few. Still, hats off to the people that developed this driver. There is a newer driver called Zinc that builds on top of Vulkan for better performance, and a new open source kernel module as well for NVIDIA. These new technologies could lead to a better out-of-the-box NVIDIA experience, but AMD is already there. When comparing to the out-of-the-box experience from Windows, both AMD and NVIDIA are similar. Both have to download drivers separately from their respective websites. Both drivers are managed separately and updated separately from the operating system. Because of its integrated nature, AMD on Linux is just a better experience than Windows. Well, that's why AMD is a better experience on Linux, and in some cases, better than Windows. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Remember to drop a like if you liked the video, dislike if you didn't, and a subscription is always helpful. See ya.